In the late 19th century, timber barons thought they had solved their destructive forest problem along the Pacific shoreline. Wait, let's step back. There was no runaway forest crisis in the vast, dense woodlands of coastal British Columbia. What they had were infestations of black rats and brown rats, millions of them, swarming the timber camps, supply depots, and coastal sawmills that funded the province's burgeoning economy. So the logging executives sent for the most relentless predator money could buy. 9 Indian gray mongooses shipped directly across the Pacific, 4 males and 5 females. The plan was simple: turn them loose in the timber leases and let nature handle the rest. The mongooses certainly hunted, they just did not hunt the rats. Those 9 animals launched one of the most disastrous ecological collapses in Canadian history. It starts bad, gets worse, and then spirals into complete catastrophe. I'm Ambrose Wilde, and the fateful miscalculation at the heart of this narrative has since been repeated across 4 continents. Start with the rodents, because the rodent crisis was undeniably real. In the 1870s, British Columbia was defined by timber. Old-growth stands covered the coastal valleys, logging camps anchored the wilderness inlets, and the entire provincial economy rested on softwood exports tied to brief, intensive harvesting windows. Miss the weather window, and you lost the year's revenue. The rats chewing through supplies and nesting in the camps were not native to British Columbia. They were ship rats off European trading vessels that found a cool, temperate rainforest overflowing with food and lacking any specialized ground predators to keep them in check. Historical estimates from timber managers put annual inventory losses anywhere between 20 and 35%. Those figures came from mill bosses with plenty of incentive to exaggerate, but no one on the West Coast disputed the overall trajectory. The camps had tried everything. Poison took out isolated individuals, but failed against the broader population, because the rats bred far faster than workers could lay down bait. Traps caught pests one at a time across lease tracts measured in thousands of hectares. Barn cats were imported by the dozens, only to go feral during their first winter in the bush. And here's the element almost no history book mentions. The mongoose was far from the first creature brought in to fix the crisis. Decades earlier, in 1844, frontier traders brought in giant cane toads from Central America, hoping they would eradicate the rodent swarms. The toads gorged on local insects, ignored the rats entirely, and established themselves as a permanent invasive burden. Imported ants were tried before that, yielding the exact same failure. So when a prominent timber magnate proposed a fresh import in 1872, he was introducing the 3rd failed biological experiment in less than 30 years. The lumber syndicates authorized the shipment anyway, because the alternative was standing by while rats destroyed their winter stockpiles. The animals were released directly onto private timberlands along the Sunshine Coast. The magnate had read reports of mongooses killing cobras in South Asia, and his logic seemed airtight. A predator that can kill a venomous snake can easily destroy a rat. For nearly a decade, it looked like the most brilliant decision ever made in Canadian forestry. Mongooses were seen prowling the mill yards and felling zones. Logging camps across the region reported fewer rodents in their stores. Timber executives wrote glowing letters to neighboring operations, urging them to purchase their own stock. Within 10 years, the animal had established self-sustaining breeding populations across the coastal mainland and moved on to Vancouver Island. By every metric the industry tracked, the issue appeared solved, except for one critical detail that nobody had bothered to verify. Mongooses hunt exclusively during the day. Rats are nocturnal. The 2 species operated on entirely different schedules and rarely crossed paths in the deep timber. The biological clock was only half the issue. Black rats are agile climbers. In the dense coastal forests, they simply shifted their nesting habits upward, moving into the high canopy, western red cedar crowns, and camp rooflines, well out of reach of an animal tied to the forest floor. The rats occupied a realm the mongoose could not access, and there they thrived. But a predator deprived of its primary target does not starve. It adapts to whatever it can catch. And on the forest floor of coastal British Columbia in the 1880s, that meant preying on everything else. Ground-nesting birds, rare amphibians, native garter snakes, and coastal marine life. On the sandy beaches of the Strait of Georgia, a single mongoose could plunder an entire nest of shorebird eggs and walk directly to the next. They raided poultry coops as soon as they realized farmyards offered easy food. And nothing hunted the mongoose back. In its native habitat, it competes with birds of prey, wildcats, and larger carnivores that keep its population checked. In the temperate Canadian rainforest, it found no natural predators, no competitors, and no shortage of prey. 9 imported animals became thousands within 10 years, and hundreds of thousands within a generation. That original founding pack left a permanent mark that can still be read in the species' genetic code today. DNA analysis on modern Canadian and Pacific mongoose populations traces their ancestry straight back to that very same tiny shipment, revealing the unmistakable signature of an extreme genetic bottleneck. Millions of animals now spread across coastal British Columbia, Vancouver Island, and outer Pacific habitats possess virtually zero genetic diversity because nearly every single one descends from that handful of siblings and cousins landed at the docks. The ecological toll came swift and hard. The Pacific jumping mouse, a distinct native rodent found nowhere else on Earth, vanished completely within roughly 30 years of the initial release. The coastal giant salamander, a unique forest reptile, disappeared alongside it. Ground-nesting bird populations collapsed across the entire Georgia basin, and the damage didn't end with the creatures being eaten. Those birds and amphibians were doing critical ecological work. The birds dispersed native plant seeds and kept insect populations under control. The salamanders and frogs hunted a completely different set of forest floor insects on an entirely different schedule. Strip out that entire ecological tier, and the insect populations it once held down explode into the empty space. That is precisely why official forestry records from the decades following the release show a massive surge in complaints regarding spruce budworms, destructive beetles, and swarming mosquitoes across the very same coastal districts where bird populations suffered the steepest drops. Nobody at the time was conducting the rigorous field studies required to prove every step of that chain reaction, and I am not going to pretend they did. But the pattern is identical across every region where this mistake was repeated, which is about as solid as historical environmental evidence ever gets. One native species is worth pausing on, because the popular history gets it completely wrong. The Vancouver Island marmot was officially declared extinct, not endangered, but completely written off. Then, decades later, a lone backcountry hunter, working the rugged interior ranges, spotted a surviving colony high on a rocky ridgeline. It turned out a few dozen animals had managed to cling to life in steep alpine terrain, far too harsh for mongooses to hunt efficiently. That remnant population is now fenced, monitored by wildlife biologists, and slowly recovering. So the standard narrative about this disaster, that everything wiped out is gone forever, deserves an asterisk. If this is the kind of deep historical investigation you enjoy, hit subscribe. We dive into stories like this every week. Which brings us back to the snakes, the very creatures British Columbia never had a crisis with in the first place. The mongoose certainly killed snakes. That part of its legendary reputation was fully earned. The coastal valleys were home to several native species, none of them venomous or posing any threat to human life. The Pacific garter snake, the region's largest native serpent, saw its range severely curtailed and now survives primarily in remote, high-elevation habitat that humans and mongooses rarely reach. The sharp-tailed snake, a tiny ground dweller, has not had a confirmed sighting in over a century and is presumed extirpated. Now consider what those native snakes actually ate: rats. They were a free, self-sustaining, native pest control system that had been silently operating across these forests long before the first sawmills were ever built. Industry leaders imported a non-native predator to control rats, and that predator's most effective accomplishment was systematically eliminating the rat's primary natural predators. In several logging districts, rodent destruction actually got worse after the mongoose was introduced, and corporate ledgers show mill managers complaining bitterly about that exact outcome within 20 years of the release. There is also the crucial question of who actually paid the price for this catastrophe, and the answer is certainly not the men who made the decision. The timber barons and colonial officials who approved the mongoose imports had the financial cushion to absorb a few bad fiscal years. The people who lost livestock out of their backyard coops, who lost the native birds and shellfish they relied on for food, or who had to spend money they did not have on reinforced fencing, were smallholders, indigenous communities, and rural laborers who had zero say in the importation and received not a penny in compensation afterward. That severe disparity appears in almost every major ecological decision of that era, and it is almost always the detail left out of the history books. That catastrophic failure is the exact blueprint that was subsequently exported around the world. In 1882, the same timber magnate presented a paper to a prestigious scientific society in London, describing his experiment as an unqualified success and recommending it to timber operations across other British territories. 10 years in, with the ecological damage already spiraling out of control on his home turf, the man who ordered the creatures published a glowing self-review of his own experiment. That single paper traveled far wider than any mongoose ever could. Logging syndicates in the Pacific Northwest, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Fiji, and a long list of coastal territories quickly followed suit, with most citing the Canadian report as their primary justification. Hawaii's outcome remains the best documented of all. Mongooses there decimated ground-nesting seabirds and the nini, the Hawaiian goose, which is precisely why nini conservation still relies entirely on predator-proof fencing today, rather than natural habitat. And the most compelling proof lies in the contrast. The island of Kauai never imported mongooses, and Kauai is the only major island that still retains the vibrant seabird colonies the others lost forever. Then, those booming populations created an entirely new crisis that British Columbia had never anticipated. In several Pacific jurisdictions, the mongoose quickly transformed into the region's primary wild host for rabies, accounting for the vast majority of reported animal rabies cases in those territories. An animal introduced as an efficient biological controller turned into a major public health hazard across half the globe, a consequence that was nowhere in anyone's calculations back in 1872. Provincial authorities in Canada did attempt to undo the damage. Bounties were offered for mongoose tails, using the exact same strategy that had already failed against the rats. Trappers laid poison across the forests, but the mongooses learned to avoid the bait faster than officials could adjust their methods. Trapping eliminated older adults, while breeding continued unchecked in the underbrush. Organized hunting parties killed hundreds of animals against a booming wild population numbering in the hundreds of thousands, spread across every watershed in the region. By the 1920s, government agencies effectively abandoned eradication efforts, quietly shifting their strategy to containment around whatever fragile habitats were still worth protecting. And the timber industry, all of this was meant to save, didn't survive in its original form anyway. The coastal lumber market was already being undercut by cheaper softwood exports from Scandinavian producers and shifts in global rail transport, structural market forces that had been eroding the industry's dominance since the mid-19th century. Logging companies spent decades and vast amounts of money battling rats, while the real threat to their bottom line was a heavily subsidized competitor halfway across the globe. No amount of biological pest control on the coast was ever going to change that reality. There is one final chapter to this story, and it is recent enough that most accounts completely miss it. On Amami Oshima, a heavily forested island in southern Japan, mongooses were introduced in 1979 for the exact same purpose, triggering the same drastic collapse in native rabbits, birds, and reptiles. Japan launched an aggressive, large-scale eradication campaign in 2000. They deployed tens of thousands of specialized traps, trained detection dogs, and sustained 25 years of unglamorous fieldwork by dedicated teams who often went days without finding a single trace. In 2024, the Japanese Environment Ministry officially declared the island's mongoose population fully eradicated, and native species have already begun to recover. So the modern ending comes with an important caveat. Completely removing an invasive predator from an ecosystem costs vastly more, takes exponentially longer, and demands far more discipline and political willpower than bringing one in ever did. A vast coastal region like southwestern British Columbia is far too large and topographically complex for the kind of total eradication achieved on Amami Oshima. But smaller, isolated coastal islands are a different story, and that is where conservation efforts are currently focused. Canada asked for a predator that could eliminate a pest problem, and 9 animals were all it took to set off a chain reaction. The timber industry got what it asked for, but not what it expected. The native snakes were decimated, the rats remained firmly entrenched in the timber structures, and the economic boom the entire scheme was designed to preserve faded long before the century came to a close. I'm Ambrose Wilde. There are many more stories of human ambition clashing with the natural world, and I'll have the next one ready for you soon.